Picking up immediately where the previous video installation had left off at, as the previous installation had covered events between 6 and 7 a.m. within the Beaumont Port Arthur battle space, effectively focusing on the Combat Engineer Battalion and Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion raced for their main objectives, which were the Carl Pipkin Army Reserve Site and control of the major road junctions in Beaumont, effectively covering the major chief invasion route, which was I-10 within this critical node, as the Combat Engineer Battalion would effectively, upon departing State Highway 96 on their advance, take Martin Luther King Boulevard all the way toward their chief objectives, which were the Port of Beaumont and its critical energy facilities, highly coveted by the CCP regime and wanted absolutely intact at all costs, as well as also the rail and port facilities of both military sites in the area, which included the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation and the 596 Transport Group's installation, both of which were heavily responsible in terms of American national security for the deployment of forces overseas and also their redeployment home, as also these facilities would be used for this very same purpose, but for the colonization efforts of China, as America was to become New China post-coalition victory, as the headquarters building of the U.S. Military Sealift Command was just to the north of the 596 Transport Group's installation. This building was wanted as much intact as possible because the Rear Admiral and his staff, considered high-value individuals or high-value targets, were all wanted alive at all costs for their immense intelligence value, which would serve China well as high-ranking officers, especially in positions such as this, were wanted for their value of collecting actionable intelligence for use after the victory in the war and the occupation to follow. As the combat engineers themselves, a rather quasi-elite fighting force with very high-tech capabilities, were the perfect force to use for heavy destruction on the one hand, but also for surgical operations on the other, as they had the tools for both types of operations. This was the ideal force to deploy in this particular mission, as combat engineers were used often for assaulting heavily fortified areas, as well as also removing obstacles to the advance of other units, as these forces would be thrown against the American defenses at both military sites, as well as also to capture the U.S. Military Sealift Command Headquarters building. These combat companies of the Combat Engineer Battalion would be gradually shed off in this operation to capture the Port of Beaumont, the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, and barely to the north, the 596 Transport Group's installation and the U.S. Military Sealift Command headquarters, as there would be 5 total companies deployed in this effort, with the other 2 remaining combat companies and the headquarters and support company sitting just to the west in downtown Beaumont, as they would cover the flanks of the operation, as well as also with the headquarters and support company providing vital logistical support to the operation, as they would truck in the vital supplies to the headquarters platoons in each combat company, who in turn would then supply their combat platoons in each company with these logistical amenities. As the command elements of the headquarters and support company of the Combat Engineer Battalion would command the overall operation, they would, of course, be liaisoning with the headquarters company over the entire 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as the brigade's commanding officer was in command of the entire operation. As now, as it was now 7 a.m., the initial assault began on the Beaumont port area. As we go to the map of the main Beaumont port area, as this 1.5 mile east-west by 1 mile north-south map essentially contains the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, with most of it on the map and very little off the map. The remaining area in this map contains the main port of Beaumont, which essentially was a fenced-in area with several main gates for entry and exit, as well as also on the Vidor side of the Neches River were more industrial sites belonging mostly to Optimus Steel, which was a steel fabrication company just to the north across the river, as the river wound and snaked through the area, creating numerous peninsulas. The area further to the north, another 1.5 by 1 mile area, has on the Vidor side the Jefferson Energy Corporation's main footprint with its refinery, chemical plant, and offices, as well as also other smaller industries which sat on the north and east of the Neches River. As the 596th Transport Group's installation sat on a peninsula, as there was an inlet into the area containing the 842nd Transport Battalion's installation, which essentially was connected to the 596 Transport Group site. These two installations, again, were primarily responsible for the ability of the United States to deploy its armed forces abroad and redeploy them home. And now these areas with their rail infrastructure, as there was a large railhead in the 596 Transport Group site and a smaller one in the 842nd Transportation Battalion site, would be captured intact, along with the actual port facilities such as the docks and cranes. And even this building was wanted as much intact as possible because of its massive docking facility essentially adjacent to it. The remaining buildings on both of these installations were permitted to be destroyed, as they were deemed essentially to have no real value to the occupation forces post-victory, and thus could be destroyed and replaced by other building types, as portable and modular and other types of buildings would be brought in to essentially construct these into forward operating bases at a later time. As for the time being, again, it was just the port and rail infrastructure that was mainly wanted intact. And with surgical precision through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, the artillery strikes called in, which were pre-prepared as the strike packages came directly from the real-time AI battlefield data processing system to the FDC elements in each firing battery. These precision fire missions from the artillery, along with the precision operations of the combat engineer forces themselves, would come together to produce an awesome spectacle in this particular battlefield, as the heavily combat trained combat engineers would face off against the non-combat troops of the U.S. Army Reserve, as well as naval and other service branch members in this particular battlefield, as the U.S. Army Reserve forces and those from the other branches were effectively non-combat logistical and support troops. They would put up the best fight possible for their stature against the combat engineers of the PLAN Marines, although they would fight with great fanaticism, as they did not want to be taken prisoner. They would gradually be annihilated bit by bit as they tried to fend off this devastating onslaught as the combat engineers advanced into this critical area, as the Americans found themselves woefully ill prepared for an invasion of this magnitude. They would still fight and fight as avidly as possible against the invasion forces. In this particular area, as these were massively critical objectives, the combat engineers would fight a pitched battle lasting a number of hours, as the fighting to capture the main port facilities of the port of Beaumont along the Neches River, as well as the military installations, as the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, a small portion of which is just off map, would be captured in 3 hours, as fighting in this area would last essentially until 10 a.m., as it was now 7 a.m. when this map opens up. Just to the north, fighting to capture the 596 Transport Group's installation, as well as also the U.S. Military Sealift Command building, would take between 7:30 and 1 p.m. The reason why it would last until 1 p.m. was the need for surgical precision to assault and capture the U.S. Military Sealift Command building, which would be bolstered by even a small number of armed reactionary civilians in the cyan color that would try to enter this facility, as, again, there would be 3 combat companies from the Combat Engineer Battalion shed off from the main body of their battalion to capture this area, as the remaining 2 combat companies and the headquarters and support company would sit just to the west and just off map in the downtown of Beaumont. Across the Neches River on the Vidor side, as immediately north and just off the map, was I-10, which initially had already been taken at 5 a.m. by a recon company from the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade's Recon Battalion. It was now joined at 6 a.m., just before the battle opened up in the port at 7, by 3 additional PLAN Marine recon companies from the Recon Battalion, as the fighting in the small town of Vidor had initially kicked off at 5 a.m. with the arrival of the first 5 total companies from the Recon Battalion, as 3 others were wrapping up a mop-up operation against a pocket of armed reactionary civilians. 3 combat companies had set up a line of contact along a segment of I-10 and also State Highway 12 within the heart of Vidor, allowing the other single company of the 5 to take the Neches River I-10 bridge, while the headquarters and support company, the 5th of the 5 total companies in the area, would command and provide logistics for the operation, as the 3 additional companies moved into the area behind the line of contact. They would move into the Vidor side of the port area and thus held the Jefferson Energy area, as well as also Optimus Steel. And as they controlled these positions across the Neches River, they were able to essentially, with fields of fire, cover the major rail bridge that essentially crossed between the city of Beaumont and the town of Vidor across the river, as there would be some military personnel attempting to escape using the rail bridge. They would immediately be cut down by the heavily armed Lynx all-terrain vehicles, which were armored all-terrain vehicles with their heavy Jianxi Gatling 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, which essentially had a rate of fire far greater than the standard 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns and could lay down an enormous screen of lead against any attacking force. As there were multiple of these vehicles just across the Neches River, as there was a single recon combat company in this particular area. They would lay down immense firepower against the retreating U.S. Army Reserve forces trying to escape from the 596 Transport Group's installation, as these events would transpire shortly after these events had commenced. This combat company, one of two, the first to be shed off into this area of the Neches River Port region, had now begun their assault at 7 a.m. against the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, as they would utilize their very advanced capabilities in terms of drone warfare and robotics warfare against the forces holding this facility, as well as their heavy vehicle-based firepower from their 30 millimeter autocannons, their 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns, and even HJ-73C short-range ATGMs, which were not only excellent weapons against heavily armored vehicles, but also were effective against buildings and light bunkers as well, as they also, of course, had their very capable GSL 130 armored engineering vehicles. These could not only plow through obstacles and fortifications, but could also destroy them with rocket-guided plastic explosive line-clearing charges, as these were effective at clearing paths not only through minefields, but also through fortified areas, as they could not only destroy certain fortifications, but also the personnel that were manning them as well. As the disposable DJI demolition robots were produced in freakish quantities, these were enormously available to the combat engineer forces, as were their quad-legged robots, which, for the combat engineer companies, each company having 5 each of these, with an additional 10 of the unarmed quad-legged robots with robotic arms to remove or place obstacles, as well as also demolition charges. Although these were very capable robotic systems in terms of the unarmed quad-legged robots, these were often held back in favor of using the disposable DJI demolition robots, as the combat engineers didn't necessarily want to sacrifice their unarmed robots, as they could easily utilize the disposable robots in their stead, as the quad-legged robots were also produced in enormous quantities. Getting replacements for the unarmed robots in this particular situation would have been mildly difficult, although not impossible, but it would have taken more time than it would take to simply use the widely available DJI demolition robots against enemy strong points such as buildings and also fortifications. As now, as the battle was kicking off in the port area at 7 a.m., the other of two companies, breaking into its 3 combat platoons, leaving its headquarters platoon just to the south, would see one of its combat platoons advancing north towards the offices of the Sabine shipbuilding or ship services building office, and also 2 additional combat platoons moving initially to the east along this particular road before shifting north and driving into the parking area of the Exxon chemical plant, as this was Exxon dock number 5, and then deploying one of their 2 platoons as they would dismount the troops to capture the buildings in the north of the port, as already the second of these two platoons had dismounted all of its dismounts, who are now moving against the Exxon refinery with two squads and an armed combat robot of the second platoon, moving initially alongside of their own platoon's vehicles and the first platoon in the convoy. Before these vehicles shifted to the north, these two squads would continue to bound and cover as the iron grip of the ISR apparatus had spotted all American forces on the map, as they had all been seen when retreating from the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, as multiple squad-sized elements of 8 personnel each had made moves for seeking refuge in many of these buildings, as they had wisely assumed, and were correct, that the invasion forces would want all of the vital facilities in the port intact, as all of these energy facilities were deemed critical for the occupation to follow, as these are vital resources that could be used to essentially send needed energy resources back to China. As the two squads of the second platoon had advanced alongside of their vehicles, initially moving down this road before turning on the road to the north of the port, the other 3 squads had made moves against the refinery to capture it intact, with one squad in the rolling T formation moving toward the refinery, as they had 3 point men effectively, one on each side watching the upper levels, while one in the center watched the ground level, entering the building. This squad in the wedge formation, pausing briefly here, entered the refinery on this end, while this wedge formation moved around the corner according to building clearance procedures for these buildings, as they would wait outside to cover exit points and entry points to the building, as well as watching down across this road with 2 armed combat robots assisting them. They would hold their positions outside the refinery, as at the opening of this map, as all of this movement from the American forces was going on as they headed towards these buildings, these 2 squad-sized groups would end up being attacked from within the building by the PLAN Marines, having had already entered it before the Americans had arrived, while some of these 2 squads would actually make it in, as they were ambushed right outside of the building. Some would be wiped out in the ambush, while others, making it inside, would end up battling inside of the building against the PLAN Marine forces, who in their stack team formations would go toe-to-toe with the American defending forces as they entered and made their way through the building. As all of this going on was occurring in the port area, the fighting against the installation was absolutely savage, as the earlier tactical, ballistic, and cruise missile strikes had annihilated large portions of the facility that were deemed unnecessary, as certain buildings were seen as having essentially no value and could easily be replaced. Some of the American forces had taken refuge below ground in basement levels and other areas such as drainage and sewage systems, which had initially protected them from the powerful missile strikes, which didn't directly hit these areas. And as they emerged, they had taken refuge in the rubble of the buildings and would use these as fighting positions to defend against the attacks now coming in from the PLAN Marine combat engineers operating in the area. As they advanced against the military installation, they were being fired upon by the American Army Reserve forces taking cover in the rubble, although it has to be said that the U.S. Army Reserve forces, as these were logistical and support forces only, had very little in the way of effective weaponry with which they could use against the heavily armed PLAN Marine combat engineers. as the American Army reservists were primarily armed with light machine guns such as the M249 Saw, as well as also their standard M16A2 rifles, hand grenades, and some with 40mm grenade tubes beneath their M16s, which were relatively effective against groupings of infantry, but not so much against vehicles and other targets, as they did also possess some stronger weapons, such as crew serve weapons like the M250 cal and Mark 19 belt-fed grenade launching system. These were relatively sparse among their formations, as they were relatively few in number, and many had even been destroyed by the earlier tactical ballistic and cruise missile strikes against certain key buildings that were targeted on these facilities containing these systems, as well as also the attacks against the motor pool and the other buildings carried out by the Chinese MSS, Pakistani ISI, and Iranian Ministry of Intelligence operatives at the opening of hostilities, as the attack was commencing against the installation of the 842nd Transportation Battalion. Heavy fire was being laid down by the 1st Platoon as their infantry fighting vehicles, or ZBDO-05 IFV versions of these armored amphibious combat vehicles, were laying down their heavy fire, as too were the heavily armed combat robots with their 12.7mm heavy machine guns. As the GSL-130 would sit and essentially not contribute in this particular operation, the GSL-130s of the other two combat platoons, however, would contribute instead, as they would fire rocket-guided line-clearing charges against the defending forces holding positions in the rubble, as not only would the fencing be wiped out by these devastating rocket-guided line-clearing charges, but so too would forces holding their positions in the rubble, as they were also struck near simultaneously by the FPV drones operated by the drone operators within the headquarters platoon. CH-901A loitering munitions, having had been fired by the headquarters platoon drone operators as well, would strike targets in the rubble, also in support of the advance of these two combat platoons. Also, artillery at this time was now coming in heavy by 7 a.m., as the artillery firing batteries devoted to the operations in Beaumont, as others were devoted to the operations in Vidor, were now laying down immense 122mm shell fire. The concentrated barrage of 122mm fire was also immensely devastating to the defending forces holding these installations, as immense quantities of shells from continuous fire missions would pour down on the area as the pre-prepared strike packages came in from the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. Large numbers of defenders would be wiped out, along with the buildings within which they were taking cover. As this occurred, motor pools were also destroyed, as these fuel trucks and LMTVs and HETs were all annihilated in the artillery strikes. The artillery also came in at roughly the same time as the FPV drones, CH-901A loitering munition strikes, as well as also the rocket-guided line clearance charge attacks from the GSL-130 armored engineering vehicles. The devastation was now total, as the ZBD-05 IFVs were also laying down enormous 30mm autocannon and 12.7mm heavy machine gun fire into the area, as heavy fire support was already coming in from the vehicles of the 1st platoon, with the 2nd and 3rd platoons now moving in. As all of this was going on, and the artillery had smashed these forces running through the area seeking cover, also destroyed the Max Pro MRAPs, which were all equipped with their crew serve weapons, with direct hits and also hits all around the vehicles from the 122mm shell fires. The platoons moving in would spread out their vehicles in this area after all these buildings had been reduced to rubble by the massive artillery strikes as they were conducting the attack as they moved into position, taking some fire as they had begun to move in, but last defenders were destroyed as they moved through the fencing, as the artillery had smashed this area to pieces, and this platoon now moved through the area. They deployed 5 of their squads to infiltrate this building as they would breach the building through its destroyed walls, which were destroyed both from a combination of a C4 demolition charge being planted by an MSS operative, as well as also the strikes that had later come in from the tactical ballistic and follow-up cruise missile strikes, which simply annihilated the buildings in this area, as these were vital supply buildings. These 5 squads entered the building and would annihilate the 20 defenders that were taking cover within it, as they had completely cleared this building with immense force, as the 5 squads effectively were 50 total personnel. They would essentially exit the building and proceed to capture the docking facilities of the 842nd Transport Battalion site, as the rail infrastructure was already now effectively being defended by the vehicles of the 3rd Platoon, having been moved in, as the 2nd Platoon now held fields of fire, watching toward the rest of the already smashed installation from artillery strikes, as the 2 installations essentially were connected by a very narrow fencing area. The 596 Transport Group's installation and the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation here to the south. The rest of it was destroyed in artillery strikes, and these vehicles again had a field of fire facing that direction, while these vehicles now controlled the rail infrastructure, and the 5 squads leaving the building now laid down fire on these 2 squad-sized elements running through the areas. Artillery was striking just off the map, trying to evade the artillery strikes, only to then be engaged by the emerging 5 squads. As these 3 squads emerged and this grouping was here, they had to exchange fire briefly, but the surprise and shock of the exiting 3 squads simply wiped these personnel out as they attempted to eventually jump into the water, as they couldn't find any other way out. As these 2 squads exited, they tactically bounded and covered, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which constantly updated the maps on the handheld combat data links, which each squad level NCO and up possessed, as well as also the ones in the vehicles. These troops already knew about this squad-sized element moving through the area, and thus begun to tactically bound and cover and vector all their fire towards these forces, who briefly fired upon them but were wiped out in the process. Now the docks have been totally taken by the combat engineers of this company, as this company was now in full control of the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation. While all of this fighting was underway, the operation to capture the port facilities was underway as well at the same time. As this platoon moved north to this intersection, they would then move into the parking area of this office complex and deploy their troops, as, again, at the opening of the map, these squad-sized elements, having had fled the pandemonium occurring in their installation, had already taken refuge in many of these buildings in the port area, including these 2 squads that had headed for the refinery, and ended up being engaged both just outside the building as they tried to enter, and also within it as well by the PLAN Marines, who had already breached and entered the facility. As the fighting was underway all throughout the port area, as this platoon would deploy their squads, and this platoon, with 3 of its squads and 4 of its armed combat robots, had seized control of the vital refinery, as one armed combat robot took position on this side of the building to watch fields of fire to the north of the building. This squad, as they engaged these 2 squads inside the building, and this squad would join in as well, with this squad remaining outside to guard the outside of the building according to building clearance procedures, along with these two armed combat robots and this armed combat robot in the parking lot. As these two squads at the opening were making a mad dash toward this wooded peninsula. It was on the other side of this lake and also on the west of the Neches River bend, which effectively made a wooded peninsula here. As they ran through the area, they had taken brief fire from both the armed combat robot when they were in this position and this wedge formation, as again, the ISR apparatus already informed the PLAN Marines moving into the area of where exactly all defending forces were, so they knew where to vector their fire and when, although there's some vehicles in the parking area as obstructions to view, as again, this being a 1 mile north-south by 1.5 mile east-west was a large area, and this parking lot was rather large, as they fired across the parking lot and shredded through some of the vehicles with the 12.7 millimeter fire from the heavily armed quad-legged combat robot and the small arms fire coming from the squad. Several of the 8 in this grouping had fallen by the time they had reached this area, with 8 more behind them, another 1 out of this grouping being taken out. The rest of them had made it into the wooded peninsula, but not before this double column formation and this double column formation, along with the armed combat robot, as these two squads were moving through this area. As the vehicles had moved north, they had begun to bound and cover tactically as these two squads, which had lost some men already, moved into this wooded area, and heavy combat would ensue in the process as the PLAN Marines entered the wooded peninsula to engage the U.S. Army reservists who tried to enter this area looking for any cover and concealment, but would effectively find none, and instead would be heavily engaged by the armed combat robot and 2 FPV drones from this company's FPV drone operators, as well as also the heavy firepower from the PLAN Marine troops themselves, the combat engineers. As they tried, again, to seek cover and concealment in this wooded peninsula, they ended up, by this point, exchanging fire and had to turn and face their attackers and took position in this thickly wooded area of the peninsula, but were gradually wiped out by the heavy small arms fire, also rocket-propelled grenade fire from the Chinese Type 69 RPGs, as well as also 35mm tube-fired grenades from these two squads, as they each had a man with a 35mm tube beneath its QBZ-95 assault rifle, as well as also the occasional HJ-08 ATGM, which was fired as well, along with the FPV drones, which eventually, 2 of which, as there were 4 launched by the FPV drone operators, would engage and destroy these forces as well, along with all the heavy fire they had taken, even the 12.7mm heavy firepower from the armed combat robot, which was along with these 2 squads. As they had passed this power substation, there was another power substation along the road which bent through the peninsula, as there was one just off the map. As these were somewhat important, they eventually would be guarded by these 2 squads and their armed combat robot upon having had liquidated these 2 squad-sized elements of Army reservists. As now the fighting over the oil refinery would be short-lived, the fighting for other areas would last a bit longer, as artillery was sanctioned to be used in this particular area, which is known as Stevens Island, would be pounded heavily by 122mm shell fire and annihilated, as this squad too had sought cover in these wooded areas, but would find none, as they had been seen long before they had entered this area, and were thus in turn pounded by heavy artillery strikes. As now also the 2 platoons had moved into this area, 1 platoon, again, having had dismounted all of its dismounts, The other platoon, the first platoon leading this procession, would dismount its 5 squads, with 2 entering the chemical plant itself, which already by now had a squad-sized element within it as they sought cover in this building. Heavy fire would be exchanged inside of this building, within its halls, within its refining areas, and other critical portions of the building which were wanted intact. And the PLAN Marines would use very precise tactics while clearing this building, and would be exceedingly cautious as they proceeded through it in terms of where they vectored their fire and how accurate they would utilize their small arms. And they would utilize their small arms to great effect. Although the precision-oriented nature of the fighting required the PLAN Marines to be extremely cautious, which essentially took more time than was ordinarily expected in order to clear the building in such a precise manner. As the fighting for the chemical plant near the dock number 5 was underway, the other PLAN Marines of the platoon that had disembarked their dismounts in the parking lot of the chemical plant were moving towards other objectives, as the 2 squads clearing out the chemical plant's main facilities were now leaving one squad in and sending another squad to clear an empty building also on the campus. One squad had initially taken position outside of the buildings along with the vehicles according to standard building clearance procedures, while another squad cleared this particular building here as well by the rail line, and then had taken position along the rails while waiting for the other squad to deem the dock number 5 cleared. As they took position along the rails, they had this squad here, they let the other squad clear the dock number 5 before then bounding ahead, and then the other squad bounding ahead, bounding and covering tactically to clear this building, which another squad-sized element had already entered. By this time, it has to be noted, of course, as these operations were underway, that there were many civilian vessels that were trapped in the Neches River due to the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes having had occurred earlier, as well as the electronic warfare assets causing jamming to redundant systems such as radio and radar, and thus these vessels were unable to communicate in any way, shape, or form or navigate, and thus were stuck in the river effectively as they were caught up as combat was unfolding all around them and didn't dare move as all of the fighting was underway, as they did not wish to be destroyed or be sunk in any type of crossfire, as the PLAN Marines did not deliberately target any of these civilian vessels. Some of these vessels would indeed receive some of the crossfire, although fortunately for them, it would generally be small arms fire or sometimes heavier weapons such as 12.7 millimeter fire, although the artillery was not vectored anywhere near the vessels, as the artillery was highly accurate at this time, as it was to be precision-oriented strikes that were occurring and not a general barrage. As across the Neches River, the troops of the 3 recently arrived recon companies were holding the Optimus Steel area to the north of the main port of Beaumont, as one company held this area, as in this particular part of the map. One squad is taking positions along the rails with their 2 Lynx all-terrain armored fighting vehicles behind them, as each squad had 2 of these vehicles, as each vehicle carried 6 troops or half a squad. The other squad in this map has just cleared one of these Optimus Steel buildings on the campus and is now proceeding through this wooded area. As that's occurring, As these forces are clearing their portions of the port, these two squads bounding and covering would see this squad entering, breaching this building as they had begun to take some fire from its windows as they assaulted this office building, while the other squad took position outside of it and gradually moved forward as the squad was proceeding through the building as they proceeded to clear it of defenders. As they were also very cautious while clearing this building, it took a bit more time than was ordinarily the case. They didn't want to completely destroy the building or its contents, as there were many vital documents and files and other types of information that could be taken in a form of industrial espionage that could be utilized by Chinese companies back home, as this was a bit of a forced industrial espionage, or a very hostile takeover, if the pun can be used. The offices and their contents were almost every bit as valuable in the industrial sense as were the facilities themselves, and the PLAN Marines were very cautious, again, when clearing these buildings. So the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had every form of open-sourced and secret intelligence possible, gleaned from the American regime and also open-sourced intelligence. They had every floor plan of every building in the nation and more, and thus used this information to assist their troops when clearing buildings so that there were never any surprises. As the real-time AI battlefield data processing system crunched all domains of data and all manner of data, there was effectively no secrets that the Chinese didn't already know, or their allies, as, of course, all the information was shared with their allies. As the fighting over the buildings was an ongoing process, which would last between 7 and 10 a.m., or a total of 3 hours within the port, a bit less time to take the 842nd Transportation Battalion site. The fighting would continue just barely to the north of this particular part of the Neches River Port area, as the combat engineers in 3 additional combat companies were fighting to take control of the 596 Transport Group site. As the fighting was wrapping up in this particular area, the 596 Transport Group's installation had already begun to be massively shelled at 7 a.m., even as these operations were underway, and the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation was already being shelled as well, as 2 of the 4 firing batteries of the PLZ-07 Howitzer Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade that were tasked with supporting operations in Beaumont were now firing into this area, as the other 2 of the 4 howitzer batteries of the Howitzer Battalion were firing at the Carl Pipkins Army Reserve installation at 7, and also 1 of the other 2 firing in support of the 2 PLAN Marine Air Assault Infantry companies that were holding the I-10 bridge to the southwest of Beaumont along the canals, as the 4 of 7 firing batteries of the artillery battalion were hitting targets in Beaumont. The other 3 were tasked with supporting the operations in Vidor, with the headquarters and support battery of the battalion carrying out the logistics and command of the artillery battalion, even as it was conducting its phased advance to a new firing position, which would further assist operations deeper in the battle space, as it would enhance their range from which they could cover these operations, including even further north if need be. As the fighting was heating up, massive artillery strikes were hitting the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, and immediately to the north, the 596th Transport Group's site, as this building had been captured after approximately 25 minutes. The two squads continued to advance to capture and clear this last remaining building. The clearance of this building went much faster as it was unoccupied by any defending forces personnel, while this squad advanced to the very end of this area along the fencing of the 842nd Transport Battalion's installation, by which time these operations had already since occurred. As this operation to clear the chemical plant had unfolded and the follow-up clearance of this building, by that time, this squad had already cleared this building and had moved towards this building, with this squad from this platoon that advanced into this parking area had also bounded and covered to assist in the building clearance procedures by remaining outside as a force that could effectively cut off retreat or enter the building if need be as reinforcements, while this particular squad breached the building and engaged the squad-sized element inside of it as they were already inside, and had fired several shots out of the windows of this building as the PLAN Marine squad advanced to breach it. And by now, as they had breached the building, they would methodically and carefully go through this particular building to clear out the defenders as well. As the operations to clear the port and its critical key industrial facilities had gone enormously well for the PLAN Marine combat engineers, the fighting a bit further to the north would involve far more precision and far more time, as the holdouts inside of the U.S. Military Sealift Command building would put up heroic, stoic, and determined resistance against the invasion forces of the PLAN Marine Combat Engineers as they sought to capture the command elements, including the Rear Admiral himself over the entire U.S. Military Sealift Command, alive and well for interrogation after the victory. The defenders of the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, having all been swept away by the combination of the PLAN Marine Combat Engineer assault, as well as the massive artillery fire led to a crushing defeat and the capture of this installation, with its rail and docking facilities completely intact, as was ordered by the command of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade. By this time as well, American military shipping had all been sunk within the Neches River, as well as also canals and also the Sabine Lake itself, as the initial missile barrage of the highly advanced YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship missiles, along with the equally highly advanced USUN undersea loitering munitions, completely eradicated these vessels, both the military logistical vessels as well as also the combat vessels of the Coast Guard and U.S. Navy as well, with no vessels able to participate in the defense of these installations, and of course, none to command by the U.S. Military Sealift Command in terms of logistical vessels. The sites would soon be the home of PLA naval vessels, as well as also other coalition ships in their stead of the U.S. naval vessels and others. As the assault just to the north of the main port and the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation had initiated by 7:30, as these forces of the main body of the Combat Engineer Battalion continued to move north and shed off 3 additional combat companies. The assault, 30 minutes later, being carried out by the combat engineer companies, now moving into position after first moving north and then effectively breaking off of the main formation, commenced at 7:30, and most of the major fighting in this particular area will have ended by 11 a.m., with 2 hours remaining involving the clearance of the U.S. Military Seal of Command building after a long standoff and exchange of fire between both sides, with the combat engineers taking very careful aim at targets in the building who were firing at them. In the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines, the battle for the 596 Transportation Battalion's installation, or Transport Group's installation, rather, and the U.S. Military Sealift Command headquarters, as well as local municipal buildings, will be covered next. More to come in the next video installation.